Shutter speed is a different beast when making video than it is for photography, so if you're here as a still shooter, then this really isn't good advice for you. This here's a dedicated moving images only channel, so you best be on your way. I don't know why I'm suddenly in an episode of Rawhide, but anyway, shutter speed is just one of the few ways that you can control light coming into your camera, but it can be confusing at first to know how to use it correctly. Shutter speed in video is about how much light is allowed into each frame. Remember, video is just a series of still images strung together to give the illusion of movement, just like flicking through a book of slightly different images to create a simple animation. So if you're filming at 25 frames per second, then every one of those frames is going to be exposed to light based on a combination of your aperture, which I talked about in an earlier video, your ISO setting, and your shutter speed. All of them will affect your image, but shutter speed is the most subtle. At this stage, it's worth pointing out that if you wanted to just have a fail-safe option to set your shutter speed at and get on with your life, then use the double rule. If your frame rate is 25p or 25 frames per second, then you want to shoot at a shutter speed of 1/50th. For 60p, shoot at the closest to double, which is 1/125th. Don't worry if you can't get an exact double of the number, this rule has a bit of flexibility. Now, if you change your frame rates a lot, especially for moving from regular shooting to slow motion at 120 frames per second, then at some point you're going to forget to change the shutter speed and wonder why everything seems so much darker or lighter than usual. Shutter speed settings can trip beginners up like that, so if your camera has the option, you can choose to set it based on angles instead of speed. If you do have this, you can set the angle to 180 degrees and it will always set the frame speed at double your frame rate. I use this professionally all the time to limit the variables when filming quickly in changing environments. Otherwise, don't feel threatened by the wrong shutter speed and experiment a bit. The worst that can happen is that you'll choose a low shutter speed of 1/20th or 1/30th to get more light in your frame, and there will be a bit of motion blur. But for a talking head video, this isn't going to matter much unless you're really flapping your arms about and throwing your head all over the place. Here's me at 1/20th. I've had to close the aperture down a little to compensate for the additional light coming in, but can you tell the difference? Notice I'm a bit more choppy? So that's the worst that can happen. Whoa, moving hands, moving my head loads. Does that make any difference? I don't know. And now back to the settings I had before. At the other end of the shutter speeds, it really doesn't matter how fast you make it as long as you can get a correct exposure, as anywhere faster than 1/120th just looks quite silky. If you're caught outside without an ND filter, you can increase the shutter speed to allow filming at lower aperture rates, but in a bright, sunlit area, you're unlikely to be able to open up a fast lens like a 1.5 using this method alone. But at f4, you could still get some usable footage. I've used this to great effect when filming highly kinetic footage like sports or crowds of people to convey a sense of urgency. Here's a sequence from a fitness event where there was just the fluorescent lights overhead. I needed to get a lot of footage in a short space of time, so I shot handheld with the aperture wide open and cranked up the shutter speed to bring the exposure and contrast back to something usable. So don't be afraid of shutter speed. Use and abuse it to find what works. It's very unlikely you will ruin your footage by getting it slightly wrong, unlike in photography where shutter speed is vital to get right, hence my massive disclaimer at the beginning. If you found that helpful, hit that like button and subscribe, because science has proven that film booth subscribers are 57% better looking once they subscribe to this channel. Meanwhile, watch this video to understand all about aperture, or this video, which is our latest. Could be anything. Take a punt.